The Seven Wonders of Sassafras Springs. Chapter 5. Day 4. Smells and Spells. Some folks in the city get Saturday afternoons off, Paul announced at breakfast without warning. Maybe we ought to try that around Sassafras Springs. Are you sure you won't need me? I was remembering what Jeb said about Pa selling the farm someday. What our corn needs isn't any more raking or weeding. It just needs time and a good soaking rain, said Pa. I promised to work extra hard all morning. The next day was Sunday, and there would be no field work done. The sun was blistering, and there didn't seem to be enough water in the world to quench my thirst. Paul rested with a bandana over his face. For a second, I thought he was shrinking into the blazing sun, or maybe I was getting taller. We raked till my arms ached. Pa told me aching arms were a good sign. They meant your muscles were growing. At the rate I was going, I'd be a match for the circus muscle man by evening. Paul was true to his word that afternoon, but Sal and I had barely got started when I saw a skinny figure coming down the road. Hubble trouble, I whispered. Let's get out of here. We backtracked through the Austins' orchard toward the house. It was unusually quiet, and I wondered if the whole family had gone to visit Jeb's cousins. Jeb had irritated me some over the last few days, but I was disappointed to find the place was deserted. Even Dusty was gone. I figured I'd head way down to Liberty Creek to cool off. On our way, Sal suddenly stopped and her ears perked up. I stopped too. Psst! As far as I could see, we were alone on the footpath that ran from the Austins' orchard to the meadow. Up here, a voice whispered. I looked up and saw a familiar face peering at me through the branches of a tree. What you doing up there, Junior? I asked. Stealing peaches? Who, me? Junior Watkins dropped down from the branch so we were face to face, or nose to forehead, as Junior was shorter and squarer than me. Junior was the same age as Jeb and me. We weren't exactly bosom buddies, but since we were always lumped together in school and recess, we were friends of a sort. Heard you were looking for something, Junior was still whispering. Who said? Everybody said. He acted like he was scared somebody was listening, even though there wasn't a soul around. Well, I got something special. What is it? I asked, full of doubt. If I tell you, will you keep it a secret? I was in a pickle. Whatever wonders I found, I'd have to share with Pa, or they wouldn't count. But I didn't want to pass up a possible wonder either. Just tell me, I insisted. You won't tell my ma? Promise. I could be truthful about that. Junior's ma was a powerful looking woman, and I wasn't about to cross her. Come on. Junior took off running across the meadow, and I tore off behind him with Sal at my heels. That dog never misses a thing. I had no idea that Junior's stubby legs could move him so fast. We ran through more pastures and fields of beans until we got to his place. The Watkins family had a huge old gray barn, and behind it, a tumble-down storage shack. Junior ran straight into the shed, and I followed him. When my eyes got used to the dark, I saw Junior reach into a jumble of junk and pull out an old wooden bucket covered with straw. You got to put them where it's hot, and this shed gets like a boiler, Junior explained as he plunged his hand into the bucket and ever so gently pulled out an egg. An egg? What kind of wonder is that? I asked. Everybody has eggs. Not like this. Junior looked so proud I'd have thought he'd laid that egg himself. I've got 3 of them. Well, eggs sure as shooting aren't man-made, as any chicken would be happy to point out to you. It's not the eggs that are special. It's what I've done to them, Junior explained. You know how we sometimes get an egg good and rotten so it makes a big stink? It was true. Boys in Sassafras Springs had a custom of stealing an occasional egg, hiding it where their mothers wouldn't find it, aging it in the straw until it was good and rotten. Oh, say a couple of weeks in the hot weather. The hotter the better. When it was ready, they'd pick a time to let loose with it, creating a stench so great it would scare the stripes off a skunk. Everybody's done that, I told him. I know, but nobody's done it like me. Remember that rotten one I managed to shoot into the girls' outhouse at school last year? I could hardly forget that. It's the only time I know when a rotten egg was launched by a slingshot. Even Junior wasn't brave enough to go into the girls' outhouse. The girls were shrieking and gagging at the smell, and Miss Collins let us off school early. But a wonder is something important, Junior. He held up an innocent-looking egg, gazing at it like it was a work of art. Been here since May. 2 hot months. Feel it. I took the egg in my hand. The more rotten an egg gets, the lighter it gets, until it doesn't seem to weigh anything at all. I had to admit, this one was good and rotten. I've got 3 of them. The rottenest eggs in Sassafras Springs. Junior sounded as if he just won the blue ribbon in the county fair. They're rotten, but they're not wonders, I insisted. Sorry, Junior, I've got to go. You'll think they're a wonder when you smell them, and I'm not giving you any warning either, Junior called after me. He sounded pretty mad. Who'd have thought collecting a few wonders would create such a big stink around Sassafras Springs? That evening, Aunt Pretty had supper all laid out on the porch when I got home. I can't stand that hot kitchen one more minute. She fanned herself with a dish towel. We're eating a cold supper outside. Like a picnic, said Paul. He always added that extra A in the picnic, and I liked the sound of it. Aunt Pretty's cold supper was as tasty as most folks' hot meals. Cold chicken, cold cornbread, sliced tomatoes with thin slivers of onion on top, and her sour pickles. A glass of milk cooled in the spring house for washing it down. A dish of cooled peaches left over from her day of preserving to top it off. What's the tally so far, Pretty? Asked Pa as he served himself a generous heaping. 52 jars, she answered. 20 jars of sliced peaches for pie, 22 jars of preserves for biscuits, 10 jars of spiced peaches. I'll do more tomorrow. That's enough to make a man long for winter. Pa turned to me. What about you, son? Did you hit pay dirt? Not today, I answered, realizing this was the first day I hadn't come up with the wonder. Ended up wasting my time. Then I remembered the day before, down at the general store. I'd promised Violet I'd come by and see her wonder. I still didn't believe she had one, but I had made a promise. I'm supposed to go to the Rowans, though. Pa chuckled. First place I'd go for a wonder. Aunt Pretty stood up, all business now. Before you go, I'll pack up some chicken and peaches to take along. Do I have to? Yes, you have to. The Rowans are having a hard time, and they could use some buildings up. Now, Yuli's proud, and she'll want to give you something in return. Just take whatever she offers. Deep down, I was glad that, unlike other folks in Sassafras Springs, Aunt Pretty didn't mind her own business, at least when her neighbors had problems. Long before, I was lugging a basket of food across the field to the Rowan small spread, which backed up to ours. Eben, you came! Violet called out. Long shadows promised it would be dark before long, but Yulie and Violet were still working outside. Howdy, Eben! Yulie leaned back on the heels of the huge black shoes she always wore in the garden. They were the same boots Violet wore to get to school in the snow last winter. Every time I saw them, I couldn't help wondering if they were the ones that blew off Mr. Rowan's feet when the lightning struck. Aunt Pretty sent this, I said, handing over the basket. Goodness, she's a generous one, said Yulie, peeking inside at all the goodies. Violet wasn't interested in goodies. Tell her, even, about the wonders. Ray Ellen called them wonderfuls, but I knew what you meant. Wonders, like the Great Pyramid and the Hanging Gardens. I told you Violet was smart. I cleared my throat and faced Yulie. Ma'am, I'm trying to find 7 wonders here in Sassafras Springs, like a pyramid or a giant lighthouse. Thank goodness there are no pyramids around here, laughed Yulie. Seems I heard about some kind of curse on that one they found last year. Violet jumped up. You have something special, Ma. Show him. Yulie looked doubtful. It doesn't resemble a pyramid in the least. Show him, Ma. He'll like it. I'll finish the weeding. I haven't seen Violet that excited since she won the spelling bee. Well, all right, come along. Yulie started toward the door, beckoning for me to follow. Sal was content to stay outside with Violet. Now, don't expect anything fancy, Yulie warned me. Believe me, it was hard to imagine anything fancy in their shabby cottage. She led me to her small kitchen table, its edges worn smooth by generations of soap and water. It looked like any table in Sassafras Springs. That and 2 chairs were about all the decoration in the place. A blanket hung from the ceiling, and I could see the shadow of a bed behind it. In the middle of the table was a single oil lamp. This is it, said Yulie, stroking the wood like it was her favorite cat. Not a wonder, maybe, but special, because this is the table that walked through a graveyard, walked on its own, or so folks would tell you. She had my attention then. What's that, ma'am? I asked, fishing my pencil out of my pocket. Sit yourself down and I'll tell you, said Yulie. I'll tell you the absolute truth. Yulie Rowan's story, The Four-Legged Haint. Sassafras Springs used to be even quieter than it is now. When the moon was a sliver, it was dark as a pocket outside. Not many lights, not many people. It was a lonely place. Folks had more time to gossip, too. It didn't take long for word to spread that there was a haint in the graveyard. A haint is what old timers call a ghost. This was no ordinary ghost, and there have been other ghosts in Sassafras Springs. Why, for years after Miss Gardner died, she'd show up in church on Christmas Eve. No one would go near that pew, and there was the golden ghost of Liberty Woods. But that's not the ghost I'm telling you about. This was a table folks saw. Yes, a table, walking through the tombstones, night after night, according to some. Not only did it give off a strange light, this table made an eerie wailing sound, like no human ever made. That's what folks said, anyway. When word spread, nobody would go in the graveyard at night. Folks started locking their doors at night for the first time. Most people were superstitious around Sassafras Springs. Most still are. Maybe I'm one of them. There was one person around who wasn't superstitious. However, she was plenty superstitious. She thought the idea of a table walking was plain silly, even though a table does have legs. Her name was Rose Ivy, and she was a flame-haired beauty who lived alone up on Osage Hill. Her mama and papa had died when she was 18, and she stayed on the farm, keeping a few animals, selling herbs like Violet and I do. Most folks thought she couldn't make it on her own, that she should sell the place and go live with relatives. Most folks should mind their own business, Rose Ivy thought. Besides, she didn't give up easily. Deep down, she thought maybe that's why she survived the illness that took her parents. Since Rose Ivy took everything she heard with a grain of salt, she didn't think the story about the haint made sense. Why would a ghost look like a table? How could a table make a wailing noise? One night, when there was a full moon to guide her, she took her lantern and set out for the graveyard. She didn't have a gun or a knife, just her old pointer dog by her side. If there was a ghost, which she knew there wasn't, a gun wouldn't do much good. If there was a ghost, which common sense told her there wasn't, a good pair of legs could probably outrun it. The first thing Rose Ivy saw when she got there was a light moving between the markers. She and her dog stopped and watched. There she saw it, plain as day, a four-legged table walking along with the light, weaving in and out among the tombstones. It was quite a sight. Rose Ivy stayed and watched. Suddenly the light stopped. So did the table. Rose Ivy's dog whined and she shushed him. She blew out her lantern so the haint wouldn't see her. She stood stock still in the moonlight until she heard the yowling. The dog tried to run, but Rose Ivy held him back. The sound was truly like the howl of a ghost, the kind that gets inside you and chills your bones. Rose Ivy didn't move a muscle or even a hair as she listened. Finally, the wailing stopped and a human voice cried out, "Mary! Why'd you leave me, Mary?" That set Rose Ivy in motion. Instead of running away, she inched closer to the table. Her dog followed, tail between his legs. When she got closer, she took a good look at the table sitting among the graves. A lantern on the table gave off enough light to see that it was set with a plate and a knife and a fork and a basket of food. There was a chair next to the table, and someone was sitting on that chair, someone too solid to be a ghost. It was a man, and he was sobbing his heart out, calling, "Mary, how could you leave me? Why didn't you take me with you?" Rose Ivy realized that the table was next to the tombstone of a young woman who had died 3 months before. That woman's name was Mary. "Is that you, Tom?" Rose Ivy asked the sobbing man. It was his turn to be startled. It was Thomas Fitzgerald, the husband of the woman who had died. Rose Ivy moved in closer. "What are you doing out here in the pitch dark?" The man moaned. "Lord, I miss her so much. I can't stand to eat alone in the house without my Mary. So I came out here every night to be with her," Tom told her, the tears glistening on his cheeks. "Tom Fitzgerald, you're going to get yourself shot creeping around in graveyards at night. You've been scaring folks half to death. You come home now and eat supper with me. I don't like to eat alone either," said Rose Ivy. "Come along right now." She sounded determined, and Tom was so surprised that he actually said yes. He left his table and chair by Mary's tombstone and went up Osage Hill with Rose Ivy. They had a good supper and a good strong cup of coffee, and when the meal was over, Rose Ivy told him to come back for dinner the next night, too. The next day, Tom took his table and chair back home. He went to Rose Ivy's house for dinner that night, and the next night, and the night after that. He talked about his dear Mary, and Rose Ivy talked about her departed family. And sometimes Tom brought her some beans or corn from his garden, or a bunch of wildflowers. And sometimes Rose Ivy sent back some food for Tom's lunch the next day. Folks talked for a while until they found each other things to gossip about, and they stopped locking their doors at night. At the end of the year, Tom married Rose Ivy, and they raised a family of their own. But every day, winter and summer, for the rest of her life, Rose Ivy visited Mary's grave, planting flowers, tending to the weeds, and talking to her so she knew she wasn't forgotten. And that's the true story of this very table, the table that walked in the graveyard. Yulie thumped the table loudly with both hands, which made me jump. When I recovered, I asked her, "Was that the graveyard at the community church?" "The same." That gave me pause. I'd just been sitting there among the tombstones the day before. "How'd you end up with the table?" "Son, I've been sitting at this table since I was a baby. Don't you know my parents' names?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, ma'am." "Thomas and Rose Ivy Fitzgerald," she stated proudly. "I still put flowers on Mary Fitzgerald's grave to this day, and I expect Violet will do the same after I'm gone. Violet's got her grandma's fiery hair and her fiery spirit, too, I hope." "Then it's all true?" "True as anything I know. Will that help you, Evie?" Yulie asked. "Yes, ma'am." I began to scribble on my pad. I kept writing right out the door. "It was a wonder, wasn't it, Eben?" It was almost dark, but Violet was still kneeling alongside the peppers and lettuce. She looked different now. Even in her shapeless dress, even with dirty hands and feet, she looked positively rich as she handed me Aunt Pretty's basket, which she'd filled with lettuce, onions, and cucumbers. "A positive wonder," I told her, and I meant it. But I'm telling you, I was grateful that I didn't have to pass through the graveyard on the way home. Later that night I went to sleep just fine. Then I had this dream where I was walking in the graveyard alone, without even Sal by my side, and I saw a glowing thing passing between the tombstones. I could tell it was no table because it walked upright like a man. I called out, "Who is that?" And the shining thing swiveled around. It was a man in his long johns, and he didn't have a face. I sat up in bed, wide awake and shaking, and had no interest in going back to sleep. I got up and leaned out the front windows to fill my lungs with fresh, cool air. The sight of the moonlight barn, the shadowy oak, and the outline of Redhead Hill was comfort. I noticed the light flickering below me. When I leaned farther out, I saw Aunt Pretty sitting on the front porch in her big white nightgown. I'd never seen my aunt so quiet, just sitting and staring out at the farm. Was she thinking about what happened to Holt Nickerson and why he had never came back? Was she wondering if he was still out there, riding that horse in his long johns? I'll never know, because that's the kind of question a boy doesn't ask his maiden aunt.